Service provision, I just want to point out a couple things that we really prioritize the importance of taking a collaborative support team approach. This is important because it ensures that we have continuity around the environments and the types of supports and strategies that we're using as it relates to the skills training that we're dealing with folks. And this is really important in helping folks to develop these new skills, to develop proficiency and competence with those things and ensure that maximum benefit. And the team approach allows us to do things like have good, effective communication with folks that are involved in the case, maybe through the waiver side, or they could be other clinical providers that may or may not be sponsored through DARS, such as clinical counselors, behavior service providers, um, person-centered coaches, you name it. But having that approach where we ensure that there's good communication and we're looking at ways to share knowledge and to continue to generalize and support one another interdisciplinary and how we implement services in a very kind of holistic, interconnected way, we feel is important. And then quality characteristics, always remember, as with any VR service, it's subject to informed choice and policy, and we need to provide services, CSS or otherwise, in a way that is age appropriate and in integrated community settings. We always want to ensure that our services are client centered and client directed, that we allow for maximum participation and participation of the client, their guardians, if relevant, and or other support team members they identify as important as we move forward with making decisions about the service, making modifications to the service, transitioning out of the service when we feel that it's no longer needed. And then then last, services should be natural, non-intrusive, non-stigmatizing, and non-punitive. CSS should never be used as a gatekeeper service, as a way to determine somebody's eligibility, in the sense that you got to do this before you can get services, or if you don't do this, and we're going to decide that you're ineligible. The best and most effective way to implement these things is in a way that is done with that informed consent. And as needed, right? We work with clients to do those values clarification, and always look at ways that we can maximize someone's sense of self-determination, choice, and control in their services. All right, next slide, please. Um, there's some bullets here on the roles of the VRC, and how they can be most effective at case managing the service. So really important, again, that you're going to be in a role where you're going to partner with the participant, their legal representatives, if appropriate, i.e., their guardians, and chosen CSS team members to determine the need and the potential benefit uh, from CSS. Secondly, you're going to want to look at that a collaborative approach to determine if CSS is needed to establish eligibility, whether it's needed to access rehab and career needs, and or to achieve an employment goal. Um, as we move through this process, and we're making decisions about implementing, and we're prioritizing that team-based collaborative approach, the VRC is going to find that they're in a role where they're going to take the lead on coordinating the provision of services, and they're going to be working directly with the client to make an informed choice about the ESO provider that they might work with, to get all those necessary releases completed so that we can have that communication across vendor and VR case management. We're going to prepare referral documents and authorize for CSS assessment, which is the initial step in developing a plan of CSS services for the individual. You're going to conduct a team meeting to discuss assessment findings and finalize your CSS plan when working with the individual. And then you're going to monitor the provision of services, coordinate routine team meetings that are needed or required to be able to monitor and check in on the services and determine if any modifications might be needed to services, as well as determine when to conclude services. Next slide. For our providers, so what are we expecting of them?
Rich.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Just real quick here, we want to make sure that our providers are in a role that they're and they understand the steps in terms of the standards of practice for how we're going to implement this moving forward, which is outlined in our policy, as well as when we do our vendor sign up to be able to deliver the service, that we'll have a contract that will outline all of these things for our vendors. But the vendors are responsible for conducting that comprehensive CSS assessment to identify current functional levels and support needs. They are also responsible for, after that assessment is done, for drafting the CSS plan. And that includes a description of specific interventions, outcomes, and strategies for skills retention. They're responsible for joining and participating and contributing to team meetings, such as the review of assessment findings that are where we finalize a plan, and then providing that intensive one-to-one services outline in the plan. So actually doing the training or implementing those interventions that are going to be part of the CSS goals and intended outcomes that we have for the individual. It's really important that when we're doing CSS, that there's regular communication with the VRC. This would include that our ESOs routinely following up with our VSCs to identify barriers to achieving the goal, to support case staffing for problem solving, and or making decisions about where we need to amend the CSS plan and or arrange, participate in other team meetings as necessary. Sometimes with CSS, because we're implementing in the natural environment, it might require that our coaches reach out to, say, a job coach if there's something going on, say, after hours in the workplace, or with folks, maybe if it's something being done in post-secondary environment, with other important supports that are part of the individual success in that, such as their case manager with disability support services in that educational environment. And then lastly, really important and required of our providers that they send written documentation to include the CSS and the plan, their RFAs, and their monthly reports in on a timely manner. Next slide, please. Um, so
Oh,
real quick, and I'm not going to read through all these, and
hold
I am going
on,
to
Richard.
pause. Go ahead,
Richard,
Sherrina.
sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I know you're on a roll, but it's time for you to rest your voice. I'm
Okay.
up. So we'll go ahead and continue. Thank you, sir.
Oh, you
I'm
are
going to talk.
welcome.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the authorization process, and pretty much how the DRS counselor creates the authorizations, the different types of authorizations that's going to be utilized by our ESO partners. In the past, you all will probably remember that generally we used one code, A1205, to encompass all things CSS, right? And because we used that one code for everything, it was difficult to really determine where someone was in the process, what type of progress was being made, whether or not this was for a team meeting, whether it was for planning, and so on and so forth. So, in looking at this, we wanted to create um, three different codes that ESOs could use to provide specific services while working with individuals. So the first code that you will see, it's a new code, it's A1205REF, and that is an abbreviation for referral. So the DRS counselor will authorize up to 2 hours. And the purpose of that is for ESOs to be able to meet with the participant, their support system, that could be their family, guardians, close friends, or whomever is in their circle that will assist them through CSS. That's going to be used so that ESOs can review any relevant documentation and information and paperwork that was given to them. And it's also a time in which the ESO and or counselor can explain the roles, expectations, and how services will be provided going forward. After the 2 hours, the DRS counselor will be able to create an authorization up to 10 hours. That's going to be for the assessment and plan. So this is new, and that service code is A1205 plan. What you'll see later when Ashley starts to present the assessment and plan, you'll see that it is one form. But the assessment is something that's done at the beginning of services, utilizing DAR's serious functional limitations to identify areas that need to be addressed within CSS. A1205 plan allows the ESO up to 10 hours to conduct the assessment and to prepare the written CSS plan. And that plan is going to be the roadmap that's going to map out what services are going to be provided along the way. In addition, what you'll see is that the ESO will also complete a pre-rating form on the assessment. And at the end of services, they will use the same document to record post ratings, which is going to include final outcomes, any steps that are needed for the participant to sustain the skills, and so on and so forth. So even though the ESO will have 10 hours of A1205 plan, it does not necessarily mean that they have to use all of those hours in 1 month. It doesn't mean that it has to occur over 2 months. And if more hours are needed for whatever reason, please have a conversation with the DRS counselor, and the counselor will be able to speak with their manager supervisor and seek approval for additional hours. You'll also see that ESOs will be able to use A1205 SVCS, that stands for services. So after the plan has been written, the other hours can be used that will allow the ESO to support the participant to achieve their goals that were identified on the CSS plan. We're hoping that the duration of services isn't greater than 6 months, but again, we know everyone is different. This is a very individualized service, and if it needs to go past 6 months for whatever reason, that's really just a time when the team can get together, talk about it with the DRS counselor. Counselor will talk about it, staff it with their manager, and that can be extended if needed. So next, I'm going to talk about the implementation of the CSS changes. There are plenty of cases right now that are being worked and receiving CSS under A1205. That is still going to continue. We are not going to break those services at all. What you'll find is that it is November. This policy and the changes have been available since November 1st, but we wanted to make sure that we gave some guidance and provided this training before all of the new forms and documents were sent out to ESOs and to counselors. But as of November 1st, and we're hoping no later than January 1, to coincide with some of the changes ESOs were making with their supported employment forms, that all CSS referrals will be utilizing the new codes and the new forms. Understandably, we know it takes ESOs some time to change forms over, so there is a grace period. And if ESOs find that they're not able to change forms over, then have a conversation with us and we'll work on that. But by January 1st, 2025, the goal is for ESOs to adopt and implement the new changes, to utilize the new forms, which align again with the other ESO reports, such as the supported employments. All the existing cases that are currently receiving CSS, they can continue up until January to use A1205, but again, that will be phased out in alignment with the other reports as well. Those concluding CSS services, they can continue using that code, and any ongoing services beyond that date, you're going to want to talk to the counselor and make sure that you're going to utilize A1205 service with implementation, because at that point, since you're already utilizing CSS, you don't have to go backwards and use A1205 referral or 1205 assessment or plan. Since they're receiving services, just continue with A1205 service. And for our counselors, just note that as we implement and start using these new codes, this will not be considered a substantial amendment on the participant's IP. So we want to introduce a case study to you because we want to give you an idea of how all of this is going to look when put into practice. So you'll hear a little bit about Ben, who's a 23-year-old male with a diagnosis of autism, generalized anxiety, OCD, and ADHD. Since graduating from high school, Ben has not made progress toward personal or vocational goals. He is seeking DAR services to build job readiness skills and explore realistic vocational options. To prepare for work, Ben will need to learn the following: how to navigate public transportation, how to become more independent in making and keeping appointments, and improving his communication skills with non-family members. Ben's counselor referred him to the local ESO to participate in CSS to assess and improve these pre-vocational skills